Hello, and welcome back to the Whitmer Cast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. My name is Jason Smith, and today we'll be sharing a special session from our 50th anniversary meeting entitled Restorations, Scholars in Dialogue from Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The panelists discuss their participation in the book by the same name. The panelists include Casey Paul Griffiths, Scott Esplin, Matthew J. Frizzell, Alonzo L. Gaskill, McLean Heward, David Howlett, Tonalyn Ford, Catherine Hill, Lachlan Mackay, and Barbara Morgan Gardner. The panel was chaired by Sherry Mesley Moraine. If you'd like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes and journals, go to www.jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started.
My name is Sherry Mesley Moraine. I have the privilege of chairing this session, which is session 201 of the John Whitmer Historical Association, set in the sanctuary of the Community of Christ Temple. The panel discussion this morning is on Restorations, Scholars in Dialogue. The book is for sale down in the lobby, and there is a book signing immediately following this session, so you can get a book and get it signed by whomever you would like present to sign it. All kinds of choices, or maybe you can get everybody. It's a 60-minute session, probably now down to 55, and so time is of the essence. We are going to have our panelists speak in turn first, and then we'll have just a few minutes, 15 minutes if we're lucky, of Q&A. I would like to introduce to you the panel members. On my far right is Lach Mackay. Thank you. And next is that Scott Esplin down there? Okay. And Catherine Hill, and David Howlett, and McLean Heward. McLean Heward. I've not met McLean before. Hi. Matt Frizzell. Tonalyn Ford. Tonalyn. Okay, Tonalyn. Yes, sorry. And then we have, is that Rich Moore?
Yeah.
Okay. And then is that Alonzo Gaskill? And then Casey Paul Griffiths. Casey Paul Griffiths is our President-elect Program Chair. He's the one who put all of this together. It's a tough job, and he's done a wonderful job. I've had the pleasure of spending a little bit of time with him. He is a professor at BYU, and so shares this special occasion with the John Whitmer Historical Association. I am going to pass it off on to Casey for the introduction and carry on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and it's a delight to be here. This dialogue has always been intrinsically tied to the John Whitmer Historical Association because it's typically when we have one of our meetings. We usually have a dialogue meeting in the fall in conjunction with JWHA, and then we have one in the spring, usually over Zoom. And I think this is the first time we've all met together since the pandemic commenced. So it's nice to see everybody up here on stage. Just a brief overview of the dialogue. I might not be the best person to describe how the dialogue came into existence.
That is so true.
Andrew Bolton is really the moving force behind the dialogue. He's in England, and we weren't able to Zoom him in, but I want to give him credit as the co-editor of the book. So we went through a lot of different iterations and discussions about the book. I think even the title was something that we had to negotiate back and forth. For a while, the title was going to be Oldest Enemies. which came from a line in the dialogue where someone said, you know, when you think about it, we're really each other's oldest enemies. And we thought, oh, that's beautiful. But the marketing department didn't think that oldest enemies would really capture the spirit of what we were going for, even though we pushed hard for it. So I think it was David that suggested restorations. At first with an S in parentheses on the end, but the marketing team thought that was too confusing as well. And so the title we settled on was Restoration, Scholars and Dialogue from Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And let me just say, this was a delight to write and put together. People from all over the world, particularly the Community of Christ team, who I want to commend for bringing in international authors. Every single author in the book was asked to reach out to, collaborate. We weren't always able to meet in person. My co-author for my chapter on ordinances was Eva Erickson, who lives in Germany. And she and I wrote back and forth to each other and then did a Zoom meeting where we sat down and nailed down all the particulars of our chapter. Each chapter consists of a statement from each person on their respective faith's position on a number of topics: ordinances, Jesus Christ, prophets and polity, Zion, sacred spaces, visions and revelations, and a number of other topics. And then a response to each one, and then a conclusion that both authors wrote together. So I'm excited to have the team here, and I'm going to turn the time over to Rich Moore, who wrote the beginning of the book, which is on the history of the dialogue, because Rich is one of the founding fathers of the dialogue. So I'm going to give Rich a chance to give you an overview of how the dialogue came to be and what we've done so far.
It's good to be here. I think there are a lot of things that led to the dialogue, but I think primarily it started at John Whitmer, where one evening after the sessions, I think Scott Esplin and Andrew Bolton sat and just discussed things, and a lot of questions, and people came and sat around and started asking more and more questions. And I think that sparked Andrew to think about the possibility. And then sometime later, again, Andrew, and this time Robert Millett, we met at a luncheon, and they were discussing the fact that Robert Millett has been involved with a number of other dialogues for several years, and they both discussed the possibility, could this happen? Could we have this kind of thing? And they looked into it, decided that yes, we could, and so we met in 2016 there with Matt at the Graceland here in Independence, and I think there were just 9 of us that first time. So it was Andrew and Locke, and who else was there? Chandra and Matt. And then for us, the LDS, it was Robert Millett and let's see, myself and my wife, and no, and who was the other? Yeah, Keith Wilson. Sure. Barbara, you're here. Do you want to come up? Anyway, we met that first time. It went surprisingly well, and we had some ground rules. We went over those, and then every 6 months we'd meet, and we met in different places. Sometimes with, like I say, with John Whitmer, like Casey said, and it was just very enjoyable. Rarely did it break into fisticuffs, and so it was a good thing, and we've been doing it ever since. So it's been one of the great blessings of my life, and it's been very fascinating. And I'm done.
Okay,
Good morning. My name's Matt Frizzell. Tana Lynn and I wrote the chapter titled Prophets and Polity, and I personally think that's a little obscure. It's not really clear what that's about on the surface. My background and training is in contemporary theology and sociology, and so I approach the question of polity through structure. How are the churches, the respective churches, Community of Christ and Church of Latter-day Saints, structured in terms of their polity? And then how do they live that polity out? I think most of us would recognize that authority is a really important aspect of structure and culture across both churches, but they're lived out very differently. The Community of Christ defines itself as a theocratic democracy, and that Joseph Smith III, I believe, definition impacts how we understand not only our sacred structure, but how it's lived out. That's just a piece of it. I think the part we focused on is how that aspect of our traditions shapes cross-cultural interactions. So what does it mean when we take this sacred structure, in many ways in almost all ways, a very Western, and then also a very Americanized structure, and in a sense, export it across cultural, national, historical boundaries. And that drops us quickly into the issues of colonialism, the history of colonialism, and how to try to be a post-colonial church. So one of the things that I learned in our discussions was that while we have very different cultures, in some ways our structures create very similar challenges as we figure out how to blend our own understanding of structure and faith with other cultures as we interact. And I could say much more, but I think I'm already over time, so I'm going to pass it over to Tana Lynn.
Well, first of all, it was delightful to write with Matt. He was like my ministering brother through a rough patch in my life, and it was delightful. One of the things that Matt and I did was to refer to some biographical moments in our own lives. So the chapter I go back to singing in a choir and watching President Kimball, who was one of our prophets, walk in, and how I was just shaking and feeling the Spirit and feeling like this was a prophet of God, and how that embodies. I do a lot of work in India, and as I interview saints in India and see their interactions with Latter-day Saint prophets, seers, and revelators, and how they feel about the authority of a prophet. And then, as Matt was saying, how also this is lived out in the polity in terms of what I call a dichotomy between the prophets and the polity. So there's a back and forth between a top-down and a bottom-up interaction. And I also, and Matt refers to his experience in 1984 when the priesthood was given to women, and he was at World Conference. And as he talked about that, it brought me back to an opportunity that Andrew Bolton opened up for Casey and I to go to World Conference here, and in 2019, and it was astoundingly fantastic to watch. One of the things that I've learned from this interfaith dialogue and interfaith dialogue in general is that when we learn from another religious idea or religious tradition, right, we see things in our own tradition that we've taken for granted, and I think this is especially true. So I talk about the DNA that is in Restoration churches with conferences and councils and common consent, right? And seeing that in action at World Conference was interesting to remind me that as I sustain a prophet, I'm actually voting, right? And anyway, you'll have to read the chapter, but there's delightful resonances and delightful differences that we see.
So Andrew Bolton and I got to write the chapter on Jesus Christ, which of course is the best chapter in the book, because it's about Jesus, not because we wrote it. Really two things that came out of it for me. One is I was a little surprised, maybe disappointed, but it was helpful to see Andrew and I had to deal with some of those prejudices, and to recognize that prejudices still exist between our two traditions, and although we get along very well and there aren't issues like that, you expect in a chapter about Jesus or dealing with the Trinity nuances between Trinitarian theology. Is this modalistic? Is this monolatrist? Is this the Godhead? And some of that was expected, but just a sense of kind of our two traditions reading into what the other one we've always thought has believed because of what we've been taught, and having to navigate that and recognizing there were times when we had to kind of pull back and say, knock it off. Let's not go there. We're actually not talking about that in this chapter. It's going to be about Jesus. Let's stick to the topic. And both of us being kind of conscious of things we hoped we had moved beyond, but realizing there were still those innate challenges that we had to deal with. And I think, Andrew had expressed that kind of epiphany of, wow, there's baggage that we all carry because of the bad blood for so many years between our traditions, even though this dialogue has sought to kind of heal a lot of that. And so that was enlightening in a good way. I think more particularly the thing that I came away with that I was grateful for was the recognition that as we focused on a conversation about Jesus, again, in spite of nuances between Trinitarian doctrine, Andrew and I both agreed in what we wrote in our conversations that both of our traditions see at the center Jesus is the Christ, salvation is in and through his atoning blood and in no other way, and that we are entirely grace-filled traditions that are reliant upon his grace. Our works are insufficient for our salvation. And that focus came out early on. Andrew and I are both converts. We both joined the Church of Jesus Christ in our respective denominations, Community of Christ, or RLDS back then, the Utah or Latter-day Saint LDS, Mormon tradition in my case, in college. And so we both went through at about the same age, this conversion experience that shared a lot of similar earmarks, spiritual encounters, focus on Christ, a recognition. He in the Anglican tradition, I in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, both had our first kind of real encounter where we saw Jesus in terms as a personal relationship and Savior, whereas before in our previous traditions there was a little bit more of a mystical, eclectic connection to God, but not as direct and individual. And so we kind of, in writing this chapter, shared our conversion journey and ultimately seeing our two traditions having a very similar focus on salvation and Christ as the rock, the center of everything our church teaches.
So I'm David Howlett, and with McLean Heward, I think Howlett and Heward were paired together. I don't know if it was like the similar sound of the name, but at least we wrote on Zion, which is one of my favorite topics. So I think a common interesting place in which we started, mask off? Okay. A common place where we started was that the Zion narrative, which I looked at as kind of Joseph Smith's midrash on biblical passages on Enoch, has been the most probably theologically impactful text or narrative on our traditions in terms of like where people move, what they do with things economically, with relations with each other, what they do with programs. And we thought about different ways in which that Zion narrative, this expansion of Enoch's story, had impacted our churches in some surprising ways. A point of difference, I think it can be summed up by a quote that I took from Tony Chavala-Smith's Facebook wall. And it said something as to the effect of thinking about our past and how normative our past is. Community Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints thinks in different terms, where Joseph Smith can be illustrative for the Community of Christ, but not necessarily normative. And that's a distinction which I think most Community of Christ folks are extraordinarily comfortable with, but also a difference where Joseph Smith is more normative in the LDS tradition. So that's maybe a way which we also pointed out some things that led to divergences of the story. The last point I wanted to make is that there's nothing inevitable about that Zion story for any of our movements of how it would be realized. And something that I thought was interesting about our movement, Community of Christ, ideas about living in holiness, living of kind of unity, for instance, or with no poor among them, could also propel us into a certain kind of orientation for being ecumenical or pursuing peace and justice. So we have a certain kind of lineage too, that we can say that out of that narrative, it helped push us in a certain direction. And there was no inevitability about that, of course. That narrative can be realized in a lot of different ways. I guess I said finally, but one last thing. I thought I knew a lot about the LDS tradition. And maybe to a certain extent I know a lot about some things, but the dialogue was a wonderful way to actually put a check in myself to realize, what do I know about this? And to be surprised by also what I learned in dialogue with McLean.
I would say, just to add to what David said, I think that was the conversations that we had between each other, between us, was one of the most formative parts of this process for me, is thinking about how to to put myself in someone else's position and see how their relationship with the past changed their journey and their present. There's a scholar in the Latter-day Saint tradition, Patrick Mason, who talks about different ways that religions interact with their ideologies. He says that we have relativistic approaches, we have exclusivistic approaches, and then we have what he proposes as a particularist approach, meaning that each individual religion can have a particular benefit to the whole, meaning the whole world. And as I look at our traditions and our concepts of Zion, they are different, and they, I think, partly come from a difference in how we view the past. But as we view the past and the differences of today, we can also see that each expression can be a beautiful way for God to manifest himself among us. For the Latter-day Saints, Zion really has a center in temple ordinances and God being with us, trying to create a community that invites God to be in that community. And I think that for me was a surprising realization at how Joseph Smith seemed to really see Zion as a place where a community gathers to build structures and relationships to invite God in their midst. And even today, our prophet today, President Nelson, in the past 4 years of his leadership of the church, has announced 100 temples to be built all over the world. And you can see how this view of bringing God into community with people is still very much present in our tradition. Anyways, beautiful interaction, which I hold as a very dear part of my development as a disciple.
We'll fight over who's going to share this time. Catherine and I wrote on the chapter on shared sacred space. And I appreciated, in fact, it's nice to be in this space because Catherine wrote a remarkable introduction to this sanctuary, The Believer's Path, and the role that sacred space plays in Community of Christ. Different from some of the other chapters, many of the other chapters explore theological or doctrinal differences between our shared faith traditions. Ours was maybe the most historical of the chapters, but looked at our commonalities in terms of space, location. So I focused on our shared interest in sites of the restoration, predominantly Nauvoo and Kirtland, where we have at times rival and hopefully now shared interpretive efforts. So I looked at, and David has done some great work here as well in Kirtland, but looked at the ways that we've interacted at our shared historic sites from the restoration, and ways that interaction has changed over time. There were times when we were much more confrontational than I hope we are now. And so the chapter explores that era and the changes that have occurred across time as we've looked to interact with each other and share our common story, particularly on site. So I look at ways we move from contestation to cooperation in our shared sacred spaces. And then Catherine, we'll let her talk about her portion, but what intrigued me as I learned from Catherine, my mind, and part of that is my research and areas of focus, but my mind went to our historic sites, and I found it interesting that Catherine in her chapter goes to sacred spaces in terms of temples. And I found that interesting in part because she went to temple much before I went to temple. And yet, as McLean said, we have inordinately significantly more. I think there are 2 in Community of Christ, and we have hundreds. And yet my mind didn't go there and hers did. And so I was intrigued by her focus immediately to temple when she went to sacred space. And I loved that reminder and learning from her on that concept.
So, yeah, I have to admit, when I picked doing sacred space at first, I thought, yes, I get to be a historian and just do historic sites. And then I realized that really in Community of Christ, I needed to talk about this temple. So you guys have the special opportunity while you are here to walk the worshiper's path and take a moment and actually walk it. Don't just be like, I have to get to the next meeting. Because I really do dive into that. I had to like recreate it in my mind because I wasn't here while I was writing it. But yeah, I really appreciated also that Scott went to the shared historic sites because that was a place that I really wanted to go in my paper, but I didn't have enough space. But he went there, and then we were able to kind of really open up this dialogue because that's really where my dialogue started with, I guess, our cousin church, I guess we'll say, was working as a guide at the historic sites. And that's something I really enjoyed working with Scott. You were very easy to work with, thank you. I didn't really feel like we ran into some of the theological issues that maybe other partnerships fell into because we were very focused on spaces. But mine focused on the temple in Community of Christ, this temple. There's only two though. And reunion grounds, which are very sacred in the Community of Christ tradition. If you don't know what a reunion ground is, we have basically like family camps or like summer camps or throughout the year, and groups get together and they're very sacred. If you ask anyone of my generation or older, and probably even younger than me about their reunion experience, you're gonna get very sacred stories. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
I'm Barbara Morgan Gardner. I actually worked with Christy and Christy Score, who is not here. I have come to love and value that wonderful woman. It's been an interesting, we actually started this with the topic of Joseph Smith and identity, and I started actually with Matt Frizzell working on this with me, and it morphed into belonging and personhood, and what it is in the Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints regarding what a person is and the value of person and the worth of people. It was interesting as we continued in our discussions and trying to figure out how we would both write about it, how we turned to very similar and often the same scriptures. The worth of souls, for example, is great in the sight of God, Doctrine and Covenants 18 or 16, depending. And recognizing that although Christy and I came from a very similar place, I shouldn't say although, it was significant that we came from a similar place, that we both taught and believed that all humans have eternal value to God. And those discussions became even more real as we shared as mothers what it was to raise children. So in my perspective, as we're writing about the value, we're talking about eternal value, and that will not change. But how individuals are perceived may change, and what kind of opportunities people have within the various faiths may change. So a woman being ordained or not being ordained to priesthood offices within both churches, or in the eternities, the divine feminine, a belief in a mother in heaven versus a dual gendered God, became quite interesting. Beyond the theological, we started talking about our own children, which brought this all to our head. With Christy talking about how she had 2 twin daughters, and this is in her article as well, who the first daughter at a very young age determined that he was to be a son, and that eventually she would have these 2 sons that are transgender. And her important understanding that they are still loved by God regardless, and it was her that needed to change and see a perception that in the eternities there's a pendulum and there is variability within that. And that she is not to place gender upon her child, but rather let the child do that in terms of the relationship with God. On the opposite side, I shouldn't say opposite, on a different part perhaps of that pendulum, both of us believing in the value and worth of individual souls, I shared simply how we adopted 2 daughters a couple of years ago. And our youngest daughter, who was half Polynesian, half Brazilian, expressed immediately that she was Elsa, and she desired to be Elsa, and she wanted white skin and blonde hair, and she wanted her hair straight. And so we talked about, what does that mean for both of our religions? If a child desires to be a boy versus a child wanting to change skin color and hair color and eye color. And how does that work, and what does that mean, and what is the reality, and what needs to happen there? So much of our discussion was based not only on theological changes and differences we saw between ourselves and the growth of the church and culture and societal and tradition, but it was also on how we use scripture within our own theological beliefs to in a sense, walk through and experience life and help in both areas. We found that although we had much in common, we also saw how we treat and how people have opportunities differently. So for Christy, she was very clear that no decision that an individual makes should have impact, especially as far as physical or desires, should have impact upon their calling. And for me, it was clear that sometimes in decisions that we make, that will have impact upon our future. Meaning a female could be ordained to a priesthood office in one church, but perhaps not have that experience in another, but yet we both believe in eternal nature and identity and purpose. So it was quite an understanding and coming together. For us, again, the most positive of all of it was we gained a very strong relationship as women, as those who clearly loved and cared for each other, and both of us would consider the worth of every soul to be infinitely valuable in the sight of God.
So I worked with Keith Wilson, longtime friend, and we wrote on visions and revelations, which quickly really became the first vision, and a little bit on the process of revelation. I had not really spent a lot of time focused on the first vision and its role in Community of Christ, so I was kind of shocked to discover that, this was not shocking, that it played no role for the first 10 years and then very limited role for the next 105 years. But I was really kind of surprised to discover that it's probably Fawn Brody who gets credit for why it became really important to us in the 1950s. It was Israel A. Smith, our prophet president at the time, pushing back against Brody, it seems. So we published for the first time our version of Joseph Smith Tells His Own Story. Soon made the decision to make it the first Spanish tract in the earliest tradition, suggesting it was important to us by the 1950s. But with international expansion, we're soon reconsidering how we share the gospel story, and again became more Jesus focused through those years. This shouldn't have been surprising, but as Keith talked about Orson Pratt in his role as chief cheerleader for the first vision, the 1838 account in the Church of Jesus Christ, in his role and how it eventually was canonized in the Pearl of Great Price, and I should have figured this out before, but the profound implications of having the first vision canonized in the Church of Jesus Christ and not canonized in Community of Christ. Of course, that means that there are very significant differences in how it's understood today. And I was left a little concerned, maybe, by statements Keith included from more recent leaders in the Church of Jesus Christ, basically saying, the 1838 account is true or it is not. And if it is not, we are a fraud. And I'm concerned for rising generations that have to choose, it seems. And maybe this is a misinterpretation, but it feels like if I was in that place having to choose between faith and history, it would be a very difficult position to be in. So I was left, and I very much enjoyed working with Keith, but just kind of with a better sense of the profound differences that the role the first vision and the process of revelation plays in the churches today.
Thank you all. You are remarkable. We have 21 minutes instead of 15 for Q&A. Okay, time for your questions. I do have to say I have read the book, and one of the things that I noticed, and you may have picked up here, is that some of the entries obviously came from professors, and some of the entries were much more personal. There was a mix of both, but still, you know the way it goes. You all have had professors, I think. Thank you. Oh, we love you all. Your questions, when you can take off your mask to ask your questions so that we can all hear you. Please address your question to a particular panelist so he or she knows if they're supposed to think and respond, or if they can just listen. And if the panelist, please, would repeat the question for those in the audience who didn't hear. Any other ground rules? I think we're good. Okay, questions? Yes.
Question is about the Community of Christ perspective on the first vision and its significance. It became, by the 1950s, in some ways, the foundational event of the church, but it definitely didn't start there. But since then, it has evolved back into, I would say, part of the story, but not the story. And maybe I'll share a story to illustrate the role I think it plays. I think it was 2004, I was in Palmyra with Andrew Bolton, who was later a member of our Council of 12, and Rosemary and Esther, who were African grandmothers participating in something we called World Service Corps. So people would come and spend time at historic sites, would improve their English skills, but also learn and tell the story. So as I was headed to Palmyra, I was a little nervous about how they might react to the Grove and the First Vision story. And I wasn't sure if a mostly white 19th century North American male story would feel relevant to them. I was pleasantly surprised to discover that it was more relevant to them than to many of our North American members, because they're living the stories of poverty and persecution and oppression, so that they connected quickly. But the Grove story, I wasn't so sure. I had this wonderful memory of wandering through the Grove. It's raining, their beautiful skin and their brilliantly colored clothes and these amazingly colored umbrellas. And then I saw a photo and I realized that I reconstructed it in my head in a way very different from what happened. But as we came out of the Grove, we talked a little bit about their experience and what that might mean for them. And one of the women said, if God cares for a poor, uneducated child, maybe God cares about me as well, a poor African grandmother. Now, at some level, I was heartbroken that she questioned her worth in the eyes of God. But at another level, I realized that what this really means for Community of Christ is a symbol of the worth of persons. All are of great worth. And I think that's the role that for many it plays today. Or at least by the time I'm done talking about it, maybe that will be the role.
Thank you. Yes, Dan.
Okay, so the summary of the question was, did we expand on historic sites beyond the typical Kirtland and Nauvoo into maybe things that were important to the Cutlerites, or like Wisconsin with Warray? Did I cover your question, Dan? Okay. So in our scope of our book, we were just very focused on Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we didn't expand out into any other traditions. And we really stuck with Nauvoo and Kirtland because those are the places where we have perpetual dialogue. As far as the community of Christ expanding into other historic sites, I think that's probably a question for Locke or Kristen, who work historic sites, and is beyond my scope. So, sorry.
Another question? Yes.
The subjects were based on past dialogues that we had held. So every time we meet to have a dialogue, there's generally a discussion of what we should talk about next time, and we had done dialogues on ordinances, on sacraments, sacred spaces, and decided to arrange the chapters that way. Now, looking back at the book now that it's done, I really feel like the one chapter that I wish we had included that we're actually going to dialogue about on Sunday was Joseph Smith. We danced around that a little bit, but that's obviously one of the biggest differences between the two faiths is how we view the role of Joseph Smith and his role as a prophet. And that's a pretty meaty topic, but we also recognized that it was a little explosive and we wanted to keep the good feeling going. and honestly, we've had some dialogues where we've had sharp disagreements, and then some dialogues where everybody just got along. We did a dialogue last fall about creation and stewardship. And I don't think there was a single contentious point made the whole time. We were pretty much simpatico in what we believed and taught there. It was really great. But every one of these dialogues has resonance for me. My topic was ordinances, because I led the discussion in 2018 when we had that dialogue. And as a Latter-day Saint, ordinances in my mind were always ordinances of salvation, you know, things like baptism and temple ordinances and things that get you closer to heaven. Literally in the middle of writing my chapter, my next door neighbors knocked on my door. They just had a baby, and the baby was jaundiced, and they were new parents, and a little yellow skin tone made them think the baby was going to die. And so they ran over and said, "Can you help give a blessing?" And so I went over, and gosh, I remember the mother holding the baby in her arms while the father and I both placed hands on the head, and I got to listen to him bless the baby, which was an ordinance. It was a blessing to me. I never realized this is an ordinance as well that is available and extended to every single person. And then afterwards, I took a few minutes to just say, hey, it's pretty normal for a baby to have a little jaundice a couple days after its birth, and we just really connected on the first level. And I went home, and the line that I had written right before they knocked on my door was from the Doctrine and Covenants, where it says, "In the ordinances thereof is the power of godliness found." And thought that was a moment where God intervened to connect with all of us, all four of us, and show us his power, maybe just the power of a kind word and a reassurance from someone that had been through what they'd been through, but definitely the power of God. And so it's been a profound experience for me, and I'm just really grateful for everybody's insights that they've shared.
The question is, how do members and leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ interact with other accounts of the first vision? I would say read the chapter, and we'll leave it at that. I will take the opportunity to go back to the earlier question, though, and say that probably the most significant way that Community of Christ interacts with the first vision is as Joseph Smith's personal conversion experience. I think that's kind of where it's grounded.
Okay, thank you. Another question? I see Vicki. I heard somebody, but I don't know who that is. Oh, me. Oh.
Vicki, can you go to the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry. I totally missed that. But I frequently miss what's right in front of me. Thank you, Vicki.
It's right in front of me now.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis.
I would like to know I don't know who would deal with this, but I would like to know about the differences in the approach of the book of the Word of Wisdom, because I know that it's different in the two churches.
Okay. Locke?
So there's I was about to say really good, but I'm not going to say that because I did it. There is a Project Zion podcast that I did accidentally. I thought I was teaching a Sunday school class and ended up a podcast talking about the evolution of the word of wisdom in Community of Christ. It really much is understood as responsible choices. It's expressed in the core value or the enduring principle of responsible choices. It's evolved through the years. Early on, it was, we lost the distinction between mild barley drinks, mild drinks, and wine, and strong drink, which were distilled spirits. So they were, in the 1830s, very uncomfortable with distilled spirits, strong drink. By the 1880s, we just thought strong drink meant alcohol, but that was not the understanding early on. And that continued to evolve through the years. But responsible choices is how it would be summed up in Community of Christ today.
Okay. Thank you. Interesting. Yes.
So I know that the Community of Christ is a member of the National Council of Churches, and I come from a tradition where with the National Association of Evangelicals, which you have a lot of like-minded groups meeting up. Do you think that talks like these and collaborations like these could ultimately lead to like some kind of national council of restoration churches where you could have like an ecumenical, actually have an organization where all the branches of the restoration can kind of formally get together and talk with each other in the way that the National Council of Churches does?
Do you have one particular panelist or?
Well, Casey Griffiths would probably be a good guy for that.
Good choice.
Yes, I'd love if something like that happened. And I should mention that the dialogue at various times has included people from a number of movements. The Church of Jesus Christ, Bicker Tonight, has often had people that participate in our discussions, and we've invited members of the Conference of Restoration Elders and the Joint Conference of Restoration branches to participate as well. The problem we had when it came to writing the book was, were we going to invite all those groups to participate, and how would we make it so that it didn't feel like someone was being excluded along the way? And then how do we set up a chapter structure that would allow comments from a number of different churches? So for the purposes of this book, we decided to limit it to just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Community of Christ. But one of the great things that's come from this dialogue is for a long time, when Keith Wilson and I would come to Independence, we called it home teaching. That's a very Latter-day Saint term. But we'd go home teaching to all the churches that we could stop in and visit. And so I've developed close relationships with people in the Remnant Church who I love dearly, people in the JCRB, people in the CRE. We even stopped by the Cutlerites and visited with them a little bit before they threw us out. They didn't throw us out. They were very, very polite. But when we invited them to participate in the dialogue, they kind of politely declined. At a certain point, I think that would be really great. And I think part of our vision for the dialogue is to also expand this circle so that if there's a common connection, say belief in the Book of Mormon, or other values associated with the restoration, we can create a forum where people can come and express and share and build each other's faith in those things. So I'd really love it if we got there, but it might be a little above my pay grade too to set up something like that.
Thank you. Another question? All right, I will take you at your no hands word. Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for being here. We miss those who were unable to be here, who tend to be regulars. This is an incredibly worthy effort, and I was delighted when Casey told me about this, and he sent me the book, and I was able to read it ahead of time. It really is a good effort, and I think it helps kind of dispel some of those things we thought we knew about the other group, but we had the wrong impression or the wrong belief, and so it kind of helped us understand what they really believe from each other, and not always necessarily why, but usually why. So I recommend the book, and you can buy it downstairs, and you can have all of these people sign it. Well done, you all. Have a good day.
We want to thank you for tuning in to the Whitmer Cast. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution. For more information, visit www.jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of John Whitmer Historical Association, all rights reserved.